Is that right? I
Yeah,
haven't seen those.
yeah, it's about 5,100 cases. But again, you don't know whether it's as a result of more testing or what it all means.
Well, it's 2:02. We've got 165, and we probably have another 100 that are going to be joining us momentarily. But let's get this going. I know everybody's time and commitments are significant today, particularly for our speakers. So I want to welcome and say good afternoon to our Fort Bend audience. Welcome to this afternoon's chat with Senator John Cornyn and SBA Houston Director Tim Jeffcoat. I wanted to let you know that this is being recorded and will be made available later today through the Economic Development and your chamber websites. We'll certainly put that out there so people can glean information that's shared with this session. I also want to thank very much the chambers and the other economic development councils and the ED directors for the city, as well as our membership, for extending the invitation for this important session. I think we couldn't do it without our chamber collaboration, and we couldn't do it without the other economic development councils in our related area, and certainly our city economic development directors. They make the participation and information sharing significant for our community. To that end, we're expecting somewhere in the neighborhood of 280 people registered today. In times of crisis, knowledge leads to empowerment, and communication is key to our ability to address current and future issues related to the health and economic recovery of this crisis. And as part of such information sharing, we're especially grateful for the Senator's time, and certainly Tim Jeffcoat, who has made himself available to all of us almost anytime we ask. For those of you that don't know, and I don't know how you couldn't know, Senator Cornyn was elected in 2002 and has been our senior senator from Texas, serving his third term. He just got appointed to the President's Council, Advisory Council, on informing the President how we get back to business. And boy, we're so pleased to have you, Senator. I'm going to let you make some opening remarks, if you would, and address the audience.
Well, thank you, Jeff, for the introduction, and to you and all my friends at the Fort Bend Economic Development Council for organizing this call so we can share information and resources and get your feedback in the form of questions and comments that will hopefully help us get through this together, which we will. Congress, as you know, has now passed 3 bills, and the Senate has passed a 4th, and the House presumably will pass that tonight, and the President will sign it. We really call that 3.5 instead of 4, because of course the main goal in that was to replenish the depleted PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program funds, which appeared to be very popular and were depleted. But the first 3 bills had different focuses, but they were designed to target both the public health consequences and the economic consequences of the mitigation efforts. Let me talk briefly about the CARES Act, which was signed into law at the end of March and which will receive additional funding today. Under both of those bills, the hospitals of the nation will receive $175 billion. We know it's a strange dichotomy that hospitals have actually been asked to forego elective surgeries and other things that help them pay the bills, and to keep beds and ICU beds vacant and ventilators available in case there's a surge of demand. And of course, all of our healthcare providers need the masks, gloves, and other personal protective equipment, and these bills fund those in a very significant way. One of the lessons I think we will learn, have learned, are learning from this virus is we cannot any longer depend on other countries to provide the personal protective equipment and other medical equipment that we need in this country in the time of a crisis, because as in this instance with a pandemic global demand, the logistics of making it and distributing it have proven to be very challenging. But beyond help for the hospitals, we then expanded the unemployment insurance eligibility, provided an extra $600 a week in federal benefits on top of the state's portion. And I know you've been following what's happening at the Texas Workforce Commission with an unprecedented number of applications being made and people trying to get in and being unable to get through. But I understand that's getting better by the day. The good news is that, the benefits are retroactive to the date of eligibility, and not, which is when you lost your job, and not when your application is actually approved. But we know we need to get that money to people who are out of work through no fault of their own. And then we did something extraordinary, which was send direct financial help to Texans who need it the most. And here again, when I think about those people, I think about folks working by the hour or for tips. Let's say in the hospitality industry, bars, restaurants, hotels, who don't have any income. And most of us hopefully think about planning for a rainy day, but many people live paycheck to paycheck. So we decided that we needed to send some money to help people who made up to $75,000 a year. They are eligible for $1,200 of this direct financial aid. A family of four making $150,000 in household income could receive $3,400. And these payments should be already made or in the process of being completed this week. So it's clear we need to give people the resources they need to cover their necessities until the smoke clears and while they remain socially distancing and even in semi-lockdown. And so the program that was the most successful part of the CARES Act was the Paycheck Protection Program that you know a lot about now. Your local SBA certified lender has had a lot of experience because Texas actually, I think, has benefited the most of any state in the nation. Tim may correct me, but I think Texas has gotten about $22 billion in loans, here again, to help employers maintain a payroll for the next 8 weeks. The goal is to keep employees connected with their employer as long as possible, because we know when we defeat this virus, when we begin to come out of it, as we will, I think, start to do that soon, then we want to make sure we can recover as soon as possible. And that means helping those small businesses, helping those employees in the interim. If the employer maintains payroll until June, then much of the proceeds of the loan can be completely forgiven. So we had a rough start, but quickly got it on track. And then that's best evidenced by the fact that less than 2 weeks after lending began, the fund was exhausted. From that initial funding, Texas small businesses were collectively granted 135,000 loans, which totaled, my number was wrong, it's $28.5 billion in loans. And finally, yesterday in the Senate and today in the House, an additional $320 billion will be added to that program. So those who have not yet applied or have not yet seen the proceeds of those loans will be able to take benefit from that. Of course, you can imagine I've visited countless locally owned businesses in like Sunbelt Machine Works in Stafford, and we've got to make sure that the businesses we love and depend on can weather the storm. So that's just one element of this. For medium and large businesses, the bill provides a $500 billion, that's a $500 billion, in Treasury economic stabilization funds. $46 billion of this is focused on the airline industry, which obviously with very little ridership is really struggling. But we need them to be there when we recover. And the remaining $454 billion will provide loans for qualifying businesses, states, and municipalities through the Federal Reserve. This is frustrating because the Treasury is really the traffic cop for most of these benefits in the CARES Act. And believe it or not, it's hard work to spend $2.2 trillion and to do it efficiently and to make sure that it hits its intended target. So I talked to Secretary Mnuchin again this morning, and he tells me that he hopes by the first part of next month that this economic stabilization fund will be available. And I know I was talking to a number of folks in the oil and gas industry, and they've been particularly hard hit by not only geopolitical missteps by the Saudis and by the Russians in flooding the markets, global markets with cheap oil, but also obviously the coronavirus has reduced demand by enormous amounts. So they're struggling too, and hopefully they will be able to benefit like all other businesses will for the Economic Stabilization Fund. So my staff has been in touch with many of you about this, and I'm sure we'll learn more from Tim Jeffcoat, who's on this video call. Many of you all know Jay Guerrero in my Houston office and Ben De Leon, and I'd encourage you to reach out to them if we can be of further assistance. So thank you to my friends in Fort Bend County for organizing this call. And Jeff, I'm more than happy to turn it back over to Jeff so we can get started with some questions.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. Obviously, your Paycheck Protection Program that you passed is wildly successful, and a lot of credit goes, I think, to the SBA and our local community banks in particular for rolling those out so efficiently and effectively. It's a testament that it exhausted the funds in so quick a fashion. Can you tell us a little bit? So we know that the bill that's being passed today and hopefully signed by the president soon thereafter by the House is the same one the Senate passed. Is it going to come out relatively the same as what the Senate passed? Yes. And can you give us some highlights of that particular bill?
Of the one that's pending in the House today?
Yes.
Yeah, that's that's almost $500 billion. You may recall Senator McConnell offered to replenish the PPP program by $250 billion. And as happens in the Senate and in the House, when people see a must-pass piece of legislation, they invariably want to add some more to it. And so not surprisingly, it grew and it got much bigger. So it's roughly double the size of what the original proposal was. But the good news is it provides $320 billion for the Paycheck Protection Program, $10 billion in advance payments of up to $10,000 for small businesses, and $50 billion for the EIDL loans for small businesses. I think those are administered through the SBA. And then, of course, another $75 billion for hospitals. That's on top of $100 billion that we appropriated in the CARES Act, and another $25 billion for COVID-19 testing. The testing issue that we were talking about offline is fascinating to me because you're beginning to see now that studies come out of New York and elsewhere that as many as 1 out of 5 people tested in a sample had antibodies, which means they had been exposed to the virus, even if they didn't know they were sick, and had developed some antibodies. That's going to have big implications in terms of how we go forward, but we need to make sure that testing is available, and hopefully people can do it in their home and don't have to expose themselves, or particularly if they're vulnerable, or have to get in front of a medical practitioner that has to have PPE, personal protective equipment. So that's the additional money. So far we've appropriated about $2.8 trillion. And we can talk more about that if you want to, but I think we all recognize this is an emergency, but at some point, once the emergency passes, then we need to think about our fiscal house and make sure we can hopefully get it back in order.
Well, thank you. The other issue that comes up about that is because it's so popular, the applications that were in the chute but didn't get funded are projected or reported in some cases to potentially exhaust even the new allocation. Can you talk a little bit about that and whether you see in the future that program continuing?
Yeah, there's been some news about some of the recipients of the PPP funds and questioning whether they really had a legitimate need for it. And there was some additional guidance that came out of Treasury on that, making clear that this was designed to be a lifeline to small businesses, not to offer free money to people who are going to be just fine through this crisis and don't really need it, like Harvard University, just one example. So my advice is that if you are interested, you need to contact your local lender and to make sure that as soon as the next tranche of funding is available, which should be very soon, I think the president very likely will sign this bill tonight, that you get at the head of the line, because it has literally been a first come, first served. And obviously some people were more aggressive and perhaps better prepared because they had the lawyers and accountants and all those folks to help them. We want to make sure all the mom and pops get the help they need too. So I would encourage you to reach out to your local SBA certified lender, your banker, your credit union. And they've now had a lot of experience with the PPP program, and they can help too. We can help, and obviously Tim and the folks at SBA can help you.
Great. Congress has now passed 3.5, whatever you want to call it, coronavirus relief laws. And, you know, I'm sure there's things that were in there that have been left out that are important to think about. Do you have any suggestions, or do you have any thought about what you guys are talking about now as to the next steps in relief that might be necessary?
Well, Jeff, when you spend $2.8 trillion this fast, what I would really like to do is to see where that gets us. And as we will monitor it on a daily basis, obviously, and see where there's additional need and act where it's needed and where it's appropriate. But you know, I start to worry a little bit that people see these as an opportunity to spend money on unrelated programs, or for constituencies who would like to see the money go because they know that it's a must-pass bill. And so I'm really interested in seeing how these programs that we've instituted here are implemented before we talk about appropriating more money. There's been some talk about infrastructure, for example. Infrastructure is something we ought to do. We should have done before the coronavirus breakout, and we can do it after the dust settles. It's really not related to the coronavirus, but if that helps us get something like infrastructure funding done, then so be it. I really think the infrastructure package needs to be paid for, and as opposed to increased deficit and debt spending, which we are doing of necessity during this emergency.
Yeah, so you do see an infrastructure bill likely in the future?
Well, you may know that the Environment and Public Works Committee in the Senate has passed an authorization bill unanimously out of the Senate for the roads and bridges and transit and other infrastructure pieces. The Finance Committee that I sit on is given the responsibility of coming up with a way to pay for it. We've been working literally for years on some ideas on pay-fors. We'd love to be able to take those to the floor and try to hash that out. But I do think there's no good reason why we couldn't do that, coronavirus or not.
Okay. So the council, advisory council of the president was recently formed, and you're a member of that. And I'm sure the main purpose is to figure out how we get back to economic recovery as soon as possible. Do you think there's certain segments of the economy that in discussions with the president are going to obviously roll out first? How do you see this whole process happening from your perspective?
Well, as you might imagine, I've been in close communication with not only the president and the Treasury and other parts of the federal government, but also the Governor Abbott, and our mayors and county judges and the rest. In our federal system, the states and local governments make a lot of these decisions with the advice and support and guidance and resources of the federal government. So I expect this to be a collaborative effort, but the fact is that not the whole country is not New York City. And I think some places can probably begin to come out of this and increase more interaction sooner than others. I think some of the things like football stadiums and basketball stadiums and mass gatherings, we may have a little trouble getting up to the new normal this year. But I would say my hope is, and I think this is what Governor Abbott's position is is that he wants to start opening up additional retail in Texas while following social distancing guidelines. Let me tell you what the reason I think that's feasible and under certain conditions. A couple of weeks ago, I went to a meeting at the White House. Before I went onto the premises, they had somebody take my temperature, put a probe behind each of my ears on my forehead. Then I proceeded onto the campus there at the White House. They pulled me into the medical unit, took a couple of swabs and tested it. And they did one of the rapid Abbott lab tests, which will tell you in 5 minutes whether you are positive. And then when we went into the cabinet room, they took your temperature again. So 2 temperature checks and a nasal swab test. And then I was in a room with the President of the United States and other leaders, and other members of the Senate and the House, but we maintained social distancing. I don't see any reason, if the President and the White House can operate with those sorts of procedures in place, that we can't come up with some reasonable way to deal with the potential resurgence of this virus while we're developing therapies and ultimately a vaccine. My hope is that sometime this fall, I don't really know when it's going to happen, but I'm hopeful that as soon as this fall, we can develop a vaccine which will be available to vulnerable individuals. And this will sort of be relegated in the same category as the seasonal flu. I don't know if that's possible or not, but I do know we can't stay locked down forever. We do need to adapt, and we do need to be careful we don't see another resurgence of this virus unexpectedly and overwhelm our healthcare system. But it's going to be a day-to-day, one step at a time process.
Well, as we look to reopen the economy, obviously there is a need to help employers, there's a need to help employees, and there's a need to help customers, those 3 categories in my mind, and instill confidence that it's safe to operate. One of the things from an employer perspective that came to mind to me, and given your background on the Texas Supreme Court and Attorney General of the state of Texas, immunity, lawsuit immunity for employers that start back up and then an employee gets sick or a customer gets sick. How do we do that from a legal perspective and protect the employers and even the advisors of the governmental entities who are suggesting guidelines from lawsuits when you don't have sovereign immunity potentially as one of those groups?
Well, Jeff, you may remember that after 9/11, we had similar concerns, and we are working now with the U.S. Chamber and others on legislation that would provide some certainty and protection for employers who follow the guidelines issued by the government, both state and local government. We know that fear of lawsuits can be a real deterrence to businesses opening back up. And we don't want that to be their principal consideration. We want it to be the health and safety of their business, of their employees, and of their customers and the public. So what we want to do is incentivize businesses who follow these guidelines by protecting them if they do. We don't want this to be the add to the lawsuit lottery and be effectively reverse what we were trying to do get our economy to rebound. We know we're in a recession for the first 2 quarters of this year. Some of the projections are that if we work our way through this, we can see a huge rebound in the 3rd and 4th quarter. So we don't want things like predatory and class action lawsuits to be an impediment to that.
So you think that the federal government will help with clarifying those things for us?
Yes, we're working as we speak on that. I think I read something in the Wall Street Journal today about the problem, and it reminded me of what happened after 9/11. So we are working on it, and we would like to include that in any legislation we pass the next installment of legislation, whenever that is.
Great. To employees and customers now. Obviously, your example of going into the White House and multiple tests for good reason, Commander-in-Chief of the country, and protecting the staff that's working on things of this nature are important. But you said it yourself, you were tested twice And testing seems to be something that's important not only to allow people to identify if they're sick, but also to give some psychological assurances that we can start to get back to business. But testing has just not been, it's been a bottleneck, quite frankly. And we hear from the news all sorts of exciting things about the Abbott 5-minute test and that we're ramping up, but it's still a slow process. Can you give us some insight into, I know you funded in this current bill additional testing. Some of the state and local money that came in the original CARES Act is being designated for things like that, PPE and additional testing resources. So we're concentrating on it, but what do you see as the next steps in that process?
Well, under current CDC guidelines, you really aren't eligible for a test unless you're exhibiting some symptoms. And as I think I mentioned earlier, that in Texas, 10% of the people tested actually get confirmation they've got the virus. But here's the challenge. I think we have to look at this not as just one type of test, because you can test negative today and then be positive tomorrow. And nobody is suggesting that we're going to test all 330 million of us on a repetitive basis. So that's why I'm so really excited, is maybe too strong a term. I'm hopeful about some of the antibody testing and some of the results we're seeing in places like New York and California and even overseas. It could be that many more people than have actually been tested have gotten the virus and recovered and have never developed any symptoms. That's pretty important for a number of reasons, one of which means the denominator in terms of the lethality of this, the lethality or the death rate of this would be dramatically lower than it appeared to be in the tested cases where it was actually confirmed. So I think we need to look at this as a spectrum, but certainly the antibody testing that's now being, I think about 4 or 5 companies have been tentatively approved by the FDA. We're seeing some, unfortunately, some fraud and some bogus testing that is not what it's cracked up to be. So it's taken us a little while to get to this place, but I think we're much closer, both making available to people with symptoms, the availability to get a nasal swab and a test in a short period of time as we ramp that capability up. But I think in the long run, these antibody tests that you can do in the comfort of your own home without exposing anybody else and without having to go to a healthcare provider offer the best opportunity for employers and their employees to know, okay, who's got the antibodies, who's likely to have some immunity, who can safely go back to work. I think we need to look at all of that at the same time.
Great. We're getting to your cutoff here because we got to get Tim Jeffcoat on, but I have a couple. It's the Chris Wallace lightning round edition.
Okay, I'll try to keep the answer short.
So one of the things that has been talked about is local government funding. And I've seen concerns, and obviously last night, rampant discussions on the news about we shouldn't reward fiscal irresponsibility. At the same time, some of these cities and special districts in Texas that are sales tax dependent and fee dependent, those revenues are gone, much like SBA assistance for PPP programs. They don't have a revenue source that they once had, forgetting for the moment all of the pension issues that might be existing in certain cities across the country. Is there going to be a mechanism to help these cities so they can retain vital staff in the coming days?
Yeah, we've appropriated quite a bit of money. I think it's $150 billion in the CARES Act. The Texas share, because it's roughly calculated on a per capita basis, will be about $11.2 billion. For cities and counties that are over 500,000 population, they could apply directly to Treasury and get their pro rata amount directly sent to them. And I know that many of them, if not most of those jurisdictions of that size, have done that. But overwhelmingly, people will be going through a process administered by the governor's office. But I would encourage all of the local leaders to coordinate with the governor's office on the distribution of that money. that's a lot of money, $11.2 billion, but you're exactly right, Jeff. Since much of our revenue for our government jurisdictions is generated by sales tax, if there's no sales, that's a tough hit. What we are trying to do is to try to make sure that the local governments and the state government have flexibility on how the money is spent. And that's the subject of much discussion. What I would like to do is to see the additional money or the money that's been appropriated now, that the jurisdictions get maximum flexibility. You know, it's hard for me to say that this huge reduction in sales tax revenue isn't related to coronavirus when it's the mitigation efforts that shut down the businesses that have caused the loss of sales tax revenue. So I'd like to see some flexibility there. But I do think there comes a point, and you mentioned some of the pension problems that some of the states like Illinois and others have. I don't think it's appropriate to use the coronavirus to bail out the bad decisions made by some states when it comes to their pension programs, nor did I think it's fair to Texans to have to bail out bad decisions made in another state. But we recognize the need now, and we've appropriated a large amount of money. Hopefully that will help. I've talked to a lot of mayors and county judges about that. Let's see how that does. Obviously, we want to make sure that they get the support they need to the possible. But beyond law enforcement, it's hard for me to see why the federal government would continue to generally subsidize the decisions made by state and local government. They have their own tax base and their own process. But the $150 billion is there, and hopefully will be a big help.
I appreciate it. I want to work with your staff to make sure that they know what direction is being given, because I don't think a lot of the money from the state allocation, we just received in Fort Bend County about $140 million, I believe, but so far they haven't given us any indication that it's available for use for replacement of operating expenses for the cities, even payroll related expenses from the reduction in sales tax revenue year over year. But we've probably reached the end of timing for you, Senator, and I really appreciate it. I can't tell you how much important it is for our constituents here to hear from the leadership that's most informed about it. So we appreciate you joining us today.
Well, thank you, Jeff, and hope you have a great rest of your Zoom conference, and I'm sure Tim can clean up and correct the mistakes I made and provide some additional information. So great to be with you. You all take care, and please call on Jay Guerrero and my staff if there's anything else we can do.
Great. Thank you. Hey, Tim.
I am here.
Hey,
everyone.
Great to have you. I'm going to let you go ahead and do an opening remark, and then that'll probably handle some of the questions that we've already received.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone is safe and well. I absolutely hope that your businesses are doing well enough for right now, and that you're getting the funding in place to help get you through the disaster. As you know, the SBA has been actively engaged in helping administer the CARES Act. In just a few days, we were able to go from an act that was signed to a new to the world loan program called Payroll Protection Program, or PPP. As you know, that has been depleted of the $349 billion that was allocated for it. And as the senator indicated, there is additional funding being considered as we speak in Washington. We hope that that will occur very soon. I'll talk about PPP, but I will also talk about the EIDL loan. But I'm going to look around. I have monitors over here, so pardon me when you see me looking away. Texas received, whoops, give me a quick second. I'm on the wrong screen. Texas received 134,737 PPP loans for almost $29 billion. So that was more than any state in the United States. I realize that of the people on this call, that might not have been you, but be aware there were a bunch of them that occurred in Texas more than any other state. Now, if you didn't get a PPP, what should you do? I'll tell you that right now, if you have not applied yet, you want to do it today, if you can. If you can't do it today, then do it first thing in the morning. The application is online. It is very simple. The main thing you have to do that will be maybe a little bit unusual for you is get your annual payroll from last year, figure out what your monthly payroll and head count is, and then multiply that monthly payroll by 2.5. Beyond that, it's a very simple application. You might ask, Tim, I don't know who to work with. I'm glad you asked. You can go to my website, and on my website is a link that will show you about 200 lenders here in the Houston area that are actively doing SBA loans. Not all of them are accepting external customers. So we have a specific column there so you can find those that will take brand new customers. So if your bank isn't participating in PPP, or if you've already tried with your bank and for whatever reason you're not comfortable going after PPP again with your bank, and I think that would be a very unusual circumstance. But if that is the case, you can find a different bank. They are there. And there are some extremely good SBA lenders here in Houston that can and will help you. PPP is up to $10 million over a 2-year period, 1% interest, no payments for the first 6 months. If you spend the funds as they are required to be spent, then the entire loan can be forgiven. I know that Jeff has posted on your website, right, Jeff?
Yes, on fortbendcounty.com, www.fortbendcounty.com, and the chambers should have it up relatively soon on their websites under their COVID page.
Okay, there's a fact sheet that I sent Jeff that outlines for you how to achieve forgiveness. It's not complicated, but in summary, if you went into this PPP saying, on average, you have 10 employees a month and you pay them $1,000 each per month, then in the 8 weeks following the loan being dispersed to you, we need to see you have 10 employees at $1,000 each per month. If you do that, and that comprises 75% or more of the funds that you spend, then it can be forgiven. So it's pretty straightforward. Now, there are all kinds of idiosyncrasies depending on your business. It could be that you have a very large labor force and you had to let go 100 people. Now, how do you get 100 people back in time to pay them for 8 weeks? Well, there is a provision in there that you have until June to get back to full employment. So you'll see that in the fact sheet and those details are there. But for most businesses, this should be a very straightforward activity in order to document that. Now, be aware that you have to document it for forgiveness, and you have to certify that it is correct. The bank is not going to double check all of your numbers. We don't require them to do that. So that fact sheet is going to really help you in that respect. Now, I want to talk about economic injury disaster loans too. PPP is very interesting and very exciting. There's a lot of buzz about it in the press because it can be forgiven. And if it is forgiven, then you could get your people paid for 8 weeks and it doesn't cost you a penny. But it's only 8 weeks. This is not likely to be over in 8 weeks. So the EIDL loan, which is directly from the SBA, may be what's really relevant for you. That can cover all of your costs. So if you're, say, a manufacturer and you need to buy parts and you need to pay for maintenance on the equipment that manufactures your goods and you need to buy boxes to ship in and pay shipping costs and all that, PPP will be of no help. But EIDL will fund all of that. So EIDL is up to $2 million funded over 30 years at 3 3/4% interest. We try to make that as affordable as we can. You need 3 numbers when you apply for EIDL. You need to know your head count, because that's how we calculate the advance. There was a misconception that the advance was $10,000. It is up to $10,000, calculated as $1,000 per employee. So if you have 10 employees, it will be $10,000. But it's up to $2 million, 3 3/4% interest over 30 years. You do have the ability to get the advance. The advance does not have to be repaid. That is a grant to you. The loan amount is going to be derived from those 3 numbers you enter, which is your revenue for the last year, your costs for the last year, and then your head count, which is where the advance comes from. So you do get a confirmation. Many of you applied for EIDL and you say, I didn't get a confirmation. Yep, you did. It was the loan number, or excuse me, the application number when you entered it. That application number you got, that is your confirmation. That's like your receipt when you go to the gas station. That says you really did do it. Two things will happen after this. One, you will get the advance, and we don't tell you when that happens. Watch your bank account. You'll see a deposit from the United States Treasury. That's your advance. The other thing that will happen is you'll receive an email from the SBA that tells you, we have your information and we're working on it. In that email, it's going to give you a link that lets you set up a direct relationship with a loan officer at the SBA so that you can send them the required information they need to finish your loan, sign your loan documents, all that kind of thing. So you can monitor all that status on that portal that they will let you into at that point in time. Once your loan exists, then you'll be able to manage your payments that way. You'll be able to see what your balances are, pay it off, all that kind of thing. Until you get that email or that advance, you will hear nothing at all from the SBA. I know that's not comforting, but that's just a fact. You can email the disaster customer service side of SBA, or you can phone them. But what they will tell you at this point is if you have an application number, then your application is in the queue. It will be worked on. Two last important things about EIDL, three important things. First, if you have an application number that starts with a 2, that means you didn't have a chance to request the advance. Excuse me, I've got a phone going off. If that is the case and you want the advance, then when the EIDL portal opens again after the next round of funding is concluded in Congress, then you should do a new application. It won't change the position of your first one in the order that they were received. It will just get added to. If you have an application number that starts with a 3, that means you were able to request the advance. And in both cases, you're okay. Your application is being worked on. The third thing I wanted you to know, and let me find that window again. Bear with me just a second, Jeff. I got to find it. I got about 4,000 windows open. In Texas, as of April the 19th, so that's a few days ago, 64,000 people have received the advances for almost $300 million. So there have been quite a lot of advances occurring in Texas. And I think, once again, Texas, if we aren't the one with the most advances, actually we're number 3 at that point in time. California and Florida were ahead of us. So there's a lot of those advances occurring. Now, I did go through the questions while the senator was talking, and I tried to answer them as much as I could. I know there are a lot that are common, and hopefully I've answered those already with my comments. We're getting close to the end of the time. I know we're ending at 3 o'clock. What should I do now, Jeff? Should I take a look through the questions and see if we want to answer a few?
Yeah, well, let me make sure that the audience understands this, that just because you filled out a PPP loan, you're not really dealing with the SBA face-to-face on that contact. You're dealing with a community bank. With the EIDL loans, you are dealing with SBA directly. Is that right, Tim?
That is correct. That is correct. And let me add to that, Jeff. I think there's an important point for everybody to know, because we get lots of questions. I get lots of questions right now. Yes, but I worked with Bank of X, and nothing happened the first time around. What should I do? Well, and they also asked me to intervene. Can you make Bank of X help me out? No, I can't. Here's the way this works. This is what the federal government has delegated to these banks, the authority to use their own forms, their own processes in order to get these loans done as fast as possible. So what that means is a positive and a negative. The positive is the banks can move at a very fast speed. The negative is we don't know what they're doing because we're not trying to control the process. We're trying to establish a process that allows things to happen very quickly so that you can get loans approved and get money into your hands as fast as possible. So as Jeff points out, this entire PPP process is happening through the local banks. EIDL is a loan that comes directly from the SBA.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I think that's certainly a big issue of clarification. I know there's a lot of frustration for the larger banks, national banks, that folks didn't feel like they were necessarily a priority in that system, and sometimes they weren't. The local community banks, however, I don't know what percentage of the loans that local community banks did, but they really did try to step up the process and did a remarkable job with the timing that was out there.
Jeff, there are several questions coming in asking if you can apply for both a PPP and an EIDL. So Tim, if you wanted to maybe address that, please.
Thank you very much. I sure appreciate you looking at those questions for me. It's easier. Yes, you certainly may. And there was also a question, I think there was a question about, can you refinance an EIDL? Well, I'll talk about both of those. Yes, you may apply for both. Remember, the PPP or Payroll Protection Program is intended to be predominantly paychecks, payroll. So it's not going to cover all those other expenses you have other than rent, mortgage interest, and utilities. So you can apply for, let's say, as an example, PPP for your payroll and apply for EIDL for all of your other expenses. Some people ask, what about my 1099s? Well, they're not employees. They can apply for their own PPPs, and you, in your EIDL application, they would be part of your cost as a contract expense. So you should be able to get the funding to be able to continue to get PPPs at work, 1099s at work. If you applied for an EIDL and you included your payroll costs, that will be a little bit of a problem, but it's okay. You apply for the PPP and you just have to tell the banker, I also have an EIDL for my payroll. What they will do is they can still do a PPP for you, but they have to fold the EIDL into the PPP that they're doing so that the EIDL gets paid off by your PPP. They'll take care of the details. Just know that you can't duplicate the payroll costs between the two loans. Also, if you apply for an EIDL and get an advance, then when you also apply for a PPP, that advance will be deducted from the forgiveness. Otherwise, we're forgiving you twice for the same amount of money. But yes, the answer is you may apply for both of them, and in many cases, both of them make sense to have.
Okay, I know one lucky question came from a guy that got both an EIDL and a PPP, but when he did the application, he didn't know what kind of loan he was going to get from the EIDL, and so he's wondering how those things work in conjunction.
Okay.
You said they roll back into one another? They roll back into the PPP program?
Only if you got the EIDL with payroll costs included. So if you applied for a payroll for an EIDL and included your payroll costs, well, they're now going to need to refinance that EIDL into your PPP. But if you didn't include payroll costs, then it doesn't have any bearing really on the PPP itself. Now, another common question, I don't think I really addressed this, maybe a little bit, is how long does it take to get an EIDL? Well, I can tell you what normal times are, and then I can give you some examples locally. Normally, from the time you apply for an EIDL till the time you're receiving funds is about a month, 30 to 40 days. That could potentially take a little bit longer right now because of the just unprecedented demand for the EIDL loan. I can tell you I was speaking to a restaurant called the Dandelion Cafe yesterday. They are in Bel Air, and they applied about March 20th for EIDL and PPP. Today is April the 23rd, and they've received both the advance from EIDL, the proceeds from EIDL, and their PPP funds. And they are spending their time now redefining how their business functions so that they can have a whole new business model for the next several months until they can reopen to the public.
Rochelle, do you have any other questions from the group?
I don't think so. I think most of the questions, other than some very specific questions that they might want to reach out to the SBA office directly, I think most of the general questions have been covered.
I would just say that for those people, just to distill Tim a little bit, for those people that have not gotten any information on their PPP program from their local bank who they applied with, it's the local bank that will have the updates. It's not the SBA that will have the updates. So you need to get in touch with your local banker. At some point, when the funds ran out, they probably stopped taking applications, or they were taking applications and putting them in a queue. Tim, do you have any any information on that? Did we actually stop processing applications when the funds went dry?
Well, yes, absolutely. From our side, from the government side, the EIDL loan portal on the SBA website closed, and our system, it's called ETRAN, not that anybody cares, but our system that accepts the loan information that the banks do also turned off its ability to receive PPP applications. So if anybody ever talks about the SBA queue of applications, there is no such thing, just so you know. It doesn't exist in this time. There is no queue at the SBA. It's like a door closed. All the applications are on the other side at the bank. Now, some banks continue to take PPP applications on a contingency basis. In case the federal government passed more funding, then they would have your application ready to be submitted. And I feel sure that right now, there are banks in Houston that would be happy to take your application to submit as soon as this portal for PPP loans is opened again. It's not directly relevant for anybody here on the call, but I think it might help you to know. My team just finished, I'm looking over at the clock, just finished a webinar where they were educating the lenders in Houston 2 different ways to enter loans into SBA system. The one they normally use, and then yet another one we have that not very many banks use, so that they could potentially enter at the same time 2 applications as opposed to doing them one at a time. So we're doing our very best to help the lenders here be as efficient and effective as possible. We want you to get this funding. We want you to be able to get this money in your hands so you can keep your businesses solvent while this disaster continues. Also be aware that if you pursue a PPP loan, from the time the bank tells you it is approved, we give them 10 days to disperse the money to you. So for the sake of argument, if you got a PPP loan tomorrow on April the 24th, you can count 10 days ahead and you should have the money within that time frame. Many of the banks here in the Houston area are actually executing faster than that.
Fantastic. We're approaching the end of this session, and I really appreciate all of the work that Houston SBA has done, Tim, and your leadership. I think this is as good of a federal program rollout as I've ever experienced, and it's indicative of the demand and the success in getting money out to folks. I hope that people have their applications in. Obviously, if you're on this call, you're paying attention, and if you need further information, you can look to your chambers or the Economic Development Council, Fort Bend Economic Development Council page for information, as well as the SBA in particular for information. We're also, Rochelle, can we capture all the questions that have been asked on the chat that we didn't get to, and then make a concerted effort potentially to get back to people with answers in the next week or so?
Yes, we will download those questions and try to get answers for people.
Very well. Well, I hope everybody's doing well. Stay safe. Pay attention. We're beginning to consider reopening the economy in Fort Bend County. I know that many cities are looking at best practice guidelines by industry and working with the business owners to do that. Fort Bend County is forming a business recovery task force under the county judge, and working with the mayors and the chambers and the other economic development councils to work through getting the best information we can so we can safely reopen and have our healthcare professionals overlook those guidelines so we can get back to business. But thank you for joining us today, and we'll have these as often as we can get valuable input to provide to you and information share. Thank you.